Christian writer, but more so, she's a great woman of God. She loves the Lord, and she is intent on living for Him and proclaiming that Christ is the head of her life and the head of her church, the head of the church. And everything that she writes and everything that she speaks centers on that central reality of that. We were talking tonight at dinner about the topic on tonight. The one that we gave her was evangelization, but what she really will speak to you about is trusting in the Lord and being obedient to Him and to His Word. Let's welcome Elisabeth Elliott.
Spoke here a few months ago, and I understand he's come back again, and he came back with rave reviews. And I read one of your president's books. I'm not sure how many he may have written, but I was very fascinated by that. If I may be permitted to mention several of the books that are back there at the book table, I'd like to do so because knowing human nature, I think that the chances of your remembering anything I say are fairly slim. But with a book, at least you can take something home and read and check back on some things. So first of all, may I mention two which are perhaps of more interest to students. I wrote this little one called A Slow and Certain Light because the question that students have asked me more than any other, I think, is how they can know the will of God. And so this is a little book about how God guides us. A slow and certain light. And then, because as I travel around and speak to students, I find that the primary concern seems to be their love life. It's just as much of a concern whether they have one or they don't have one. So this is a book about what it means to bring your love life, existent or non-existent, under the lordship of Jesus Christ. It's called Passion and Purity. And as one man said to me, well, he says, I've tried the purity route, now tell me about this passion. For some of the older ones who have children between the ages of 11 and 16 whom you love, maybe they're grandchildren, maybe they're children, but anybody in this room who knows anybody between 11 and 16, here's a little tiny booklet, 12 pages, called Sex is a Lot More Than Fun. It was written because I got so appalled when I read Time Magazine's cover story about 6 months ago about teenage pregnancy. And I wondered what we could do to get to these kids early enough so that they stay out of bed. It's a book not about how to do it. It's a book about how not to do it. Sex is a lot more than fun. And then a book for nobody in this room, I'm sure, but you might know somebody that needs a little discipline. It's called Discipline, the Glad Surrender, and it's a book about personal discipline. Discipline of the body, the mind, the emotions, time, work, and possessions. So much for that. I hope you'll meet my handsome Norwegian husband back there at the book table. I want you to know that my name really is Elisabeth Gren, G-R-E-N. But as some of you may know, Lars is husband number 3. And it is a bit much to expect my audiences to keep up with all my marriages. My first husband I'm going to be telling you a little bit about this evening. My second husband was Addison Leach, who was once president of Pittsburgh Seminary. I'm delighted that one of his 3 daughters is here tonight with her 4 children and her husband. They live in Pittsburgh. And Lars gets called Mr. Elliot every now and then, and he can roll with the punches. He said, "I'm Mr. Elliot III." His name is really Lars, rhymes with stars. Grin rhymes with wren. And so please make yourself known to him, and he'll be glad to help you with the books or tapes or whatever. It was nearly 30 years ago that I was living in a very strange place among a very strange people to whom I was more than strange. I was a freak in every imaginable way. I was living in a small clearing in the eastern jungle of Ecuador, the Amazon rainforest, actually, with a people called Aucas, A-U-C-A. They were a Stone Age tribe about which very little had been known until we went in to live with them. And they lived in houses with no walls, no floors, and no furniture. So being a missionary who felt very strongly that her responsibility was to identify as much as possible with the people to whom she went, I also lived in a house with no walls, no floors, and no furniture. I drew the line when it came to adopting their costume. It was a piece of string. Not a G-string, a piece of string. They wore it around their hips, men and women alike. If they wanted to be very dressed up, they sometimes wore a piece of string around their upper arm, occasionally around their thigh. But I was a freak in every imaginable way already, so the matter of freakishness in dress was really not very distracting to them. I thought I would just give you a little vignette of what an ordinary day was like living with those people. They were smart enough to come home after work, eat their supper, and go straight to bed. In civilized countries, we haven't caught on to the wisdom of that yet, and we come home exhausted. We eat, we sit around and talk and try to be scintillating and interesting, or we slump in front of the television until we fall asleep, but we haven't got sense enough to go to bed. The fact that the Alca Indians went to bed between 6:30 and 7 meant that they got up, usually between 2 and 3. But I don't mean they got out of bed. I mean they began their social life, which was a much more sensible time to have it than what we do in these so-called civilized countries. The fact that they had no walls meant that they could carry on conversations all the way around the clearing, getting out of bed. Their beds were hammocks. Everybody slept in hammocks strung around a fire. But generally, before there was conversation, there would be singing. And I never quite got onto this schedule myself. I would sit in my hammock by the fire and pray, meditate, think, try to go over what few words of their language I might have learned that day. I didn't have light at night. Candles were pretty precious when they had to be carried 3 days over the trail. And so generally I spent an hour or so just sitting there by the fire and pondering what I was doing in a place like this. So I wouldn't be quite so eager to get up in the morning or join in the conversation, but I would lie there in my hammock, and sometimes this music would fit into my dreams for a while, and then gradually I would come awake and hear the conversation and start my usual job of taking notes, trying to put down everything that I heard people say. But their singing was different from what we heard tonight. They had a maximum of 3 notes, sometimes 2. And the song would go like this. Well, I felt just the way you do. How do you turn it off? Listen, I have mercy on you because I have counted as many as 70 repetitions of verse 1. And then they go on etc., etc., and then they would begin talking. Well, there were two teenage boys who had built themselves an observation platform in the house next door to mine in order not to miss anything that went on in my house. I was head and shoulders taller than the tallest woman. I was a head taller than the tallest man. I had the most pitiful colored skin that they had ever seen. These people were so isolated that hardly any of them had ever seen a stranger. I don't say that they had never seen a white woman. They had never seen anybody of any color other than themselves. They had never seen anybody they didn't know. There were other Indian tribes in the area, but they had never come across them. They were so isolated. And so not only was I a giant, I was a pitiful, pale, washed out color. I had hair, they said, that looked like palm fiber, eyes that looked like a jaguar's. And so these two teenage boys, whose names were Komi and Kinda, would be lying prone on their stomachs on this observation platform, which was built of bamboo, leaning over the edge every morning, waiting for the first event of the day of which they could make an announcement. That would be when I would open my eyes, those weird blue eyes, and these two boys would call out, "Bah, Nyang Mahamba," which means, "She's awake." And that stunning piece of news would be relayed. My little daughter was 3 years old. She lived in that same house. She slept on a bamboo slab about 3 inches off the ground, and my hammock was sort of strung over to the top of that. And there was another foreign lady living in the house next door. She was the sister of one of the men that was with my husband. I'll tell you a little bit of that story later on. But here we were, three pale foreigners with blue eyes, living in the midst of these strange people. And nothing about us was anything but weird and freakish and laughable. I would then get out of my hammock, unwrap myself from the blanket in which I slept, hang the blanket up underneath the thatched roof, and take out of a rubber bag a small transistor radio, which I would then start to carry across the clearing to attach to a bamboo pole on which was the aerial. This was in order to give us contact with the missionary aviation base. And so as I took the radio out and began to walk across the clearing, the second announcement would be made, which means there she goes with that radio again. So they made up a word for radio, which means the talking thing. And as I walked across the clearing, each step would be accompanied by sound effects in unison. Now, if you want to make your next door neighbor feel extremely sheepish, stick your head out the kitchen window as he's walking to the garage. I never thought of myself as a comedian until I lived with the Alkas, and I discovered that absolutely everything I did was just hilariously funny. I didn't walk the way they did, I didn't look the way they did, I didn't talk the way they did, I didn't eat the way they did. I didn't know how to make clay pots, I didn't know how to weave hammocks, I couldn't catch fish with my hands, I couldn't swim in the jetty. And they would throw up their hands in despair after asking me to try these things, and they insisted that I try them, and I demonstrated to them that I couldn't do them. And they would say, "What do you do?" Well, I walked around with a notebook, and I made funny little squiggles on the paper. And they smelled it, and they said, "That's made of wood, isn't it?" Pretty astute. And I said, "Yes." Well, what was I doing? Well, how was I supposed to tell them what I was doing? I couldn't even understand the question for the first year or so. All I could do was try to write down, as I had been trained at the University of Oklahoma, to write any sound that the human voice is capable of making, hoping that one way or another, sometime, I would be able to figure out what it meant. There were no interpreters. Nobody had ever learned this language before. They didn't know any Indian language which I knew. I had learned Spanish and 2 other Indian languages before I went to live with this particular tribe. And you can imagine how much you would get down on paper if somebody said to you, "Oh, mine, go with Danny." And if you can say, "What did you say?" which is certainly a phrase that I did learn fairly soon, out of doubt, "What did you say?" then they would very likely give you a paragraph of explanation of what they said rather than repeating the phrase so that you could write it down. But that's more or less what I did all day long. And I'm not going to go through minute by minute, but just to give you a picture of how alien a missionary may often be. And perhaps not very much more alien than you and I sometimes feel in our own culture, in our own tongue, when we're trying to present the claims of Jesus Christ to someone to whom religion is just one tiny little, rather boring area that some people are interested in, but he isn't. We are, all of us, faced with the problem of communication, of identification. As Mary Kay mentioned, I was asked to speak on the subject of evangelism, and I've never been an evangelist. I am not an evangelist, and I hardly know where to begin. But I do like the word witness, because I'm convinced that every one of us, as Christians, are called to be a witness. A witness is simply somebody who knows something that other people don't know. If you're called upon to testify in court, it will be because you know something or you have seen something that others don't know. And if we know Jesus Christ, then everything that we do ought to make that truth visible. That's my definition of witnessing, making the truth visible. It's not by any means always making it audible and verbal, but everything that we do reveals who we are, and more importantly, infinitely more importantly, whose we are. So there I was, living in a house with no walls, with my little daughter, being a freak, being, as they could not help but be convinced, that I was retarded, seriously retarded, because they had never heard of anybody that didn't speak their language. And they would examine my ears to see if my ears were made like theirs, and they thought, well, maybe it doesn't go in. And they would ask to look down my throat to see if I had the proper equipment for speaking. Well, they could hear me speaking to my daughter, but it didn't make any sense what I said to her. And the most appalling humiliation was to find that my 3-year-old daughter learned to speak their language within about 2 months. And I had made up my mind that I would learn exactly what she learned every day. I had the experience of watching her learn 2 other languages already. She was bilingual by the time she was 3, and she was trilingual shortly thereafter. And so I thought, well, maybe, in view of the fact that I majored in language in college and studied linguistics after college and had learned 3 languages and have a notebook and a tape recorder, perhaps I can keep up with a 3-year-old. And so it was just further proof to the Indians that this huge, seemingly adult female was retarded. I lived there. I learned their language. And my purpose, of course, there as everywhere else that I had ever lived or worked, was to love God, to know God, and to make Him known and loved. That is my purpose in life, to know Him, to love Him, to make Him known and loved. One of those long evenings when I was sitting there meditating by my fire, I lit a candle and I was looking at the 43rd chapter of Isaiah, and I came across a verse about witnessing, which rather startled me. It says this, "You are my witnesses, and my servant, whom I have chosen, that you might know and believe me, and understand that I am he. And I was taken aback to realize that if I had been asked to write about witnessing, I would have said, you are my witnesses, that they might know and believe me and understand that I am he. But God says, you are my witnesses, that you might know and believe me. And in my feelings of utter frustration and helplessness in a situation such as I had never been in my up till then 8 years of missionary work, I was given great rest and relief to realize that my primary job was still what it had always been, to learn to know God, with the hope and the prayer that in His way and by the power of His Holy Spirit, that loving Him and knowing Him would become visible, even perhaps before I would be able to make it verbal to these people. How do we learn to know and love God? Well, 2 simple words. 2 simple words that I always think of when I think of the old gospel song that we used to sing when I was growing up in a Christian home in Philadelphia, where we had family prayers twice a day. We began the morning time of prayer with hymn singing. Both my parents played the piano, and so one of the other would sit down at the piano, and we went straight through a hymn book. 1 hymn per day, the next hymn in the book, and we sang all the stanzas. And consequently, all 6 of us children learned literally hundreds of hymns by heart without any effort at all. As you parents know, the memorization powers of a child up to the age of about 3 or 4 are nothing short of miraculous. They can learn almost anything, let's say, without effort, any visible effort whatsoever. And so we learned theology by learning hymns. And one that can't be surpassed in profundity or in simplicity is one that says, trust and obey, for there's no other way to be happy in Jesus but to trust and obey. So when we ask, what is the method by which we learn to know and love God? This is the answer: by trust and obedience. As I look back over 6 decades and see the hand of God leading me faithfully, unfailingly through all those years and all those experiences, I'm more convinced than ever that every single experience in life, whether of joy or sorrow, of light or darkness, of shadow or sunshine, is meant for one purpose, and that is to bring me to the knowledge of Jesus Christ, to give me the opportunity and the privilege of learning to know Him. And so let me go back a few years before I was living in that clearing in the jungle that I've described, to how I got there. It was when I was a college student that I began to observe a certain student on campus of the opposite sex. I and probably several hundred other women particularly observed this man because he was known to be a woman hater. And guys, I've got advice for you. If you really want to be pursued by all the barracudas, just let it be known that you really aren't interested. And you'll probably be more pursued than anybody else. Well, this man, his name was Jim Elliott. And it wasn't by any means that Jim was not interested in women. It's just that he had discovered that they were a tremendous waste of time and money when he was in high school. And so he decided that if he was going to keep his mind on his studies and get not only a BA degree, but what he called the AUG, he was going to have to eliminate some things from his program. The AUG, he took from Paul's letter to Timothy, that he was to be approved unto God. And if Jim had to choose between the BA and the AUG, he had decided decided that what was more important was the AUG. He was hoping to get both. And so he decided that, among other things, he would eliminate dating. And so he was much watched and scrutinized and talked about and observed by many of the women on campus, and I was one of them. I liked what I saw. Jim Elliot would stand in dining hall lines with little packs of white cards. Sometimes he was memorizing Greek verbs, sometimes he was memorizing scripture verses. I saw, here's a man who doesn't waste his time. He was very friendly. It wasn't that he shut himself off from other people. He was a campus clown. We could call on him for any occasion to get up at a moment's notice and recite from memory things like Robert Service's poetry, The Face on the Barroom Floor, or The Shooting of Dan McGrew, or The Cremation of Sam McGee. Jim was not only a campus clown, he was a spiritual leader. He was the president of the Foreign Missions Fellowship, and was avoided by some of his fellow students because he would get up, he would grab a guy by the arm or the lapel and he'd say, "Hey buddy, how come you're not going to the mission field?" Because Jim took the view that if a man was not going to the mission field, he jolly well better be able to prove that God had not called him. It was not Jim's business to prove that God had called him, because it was very plain in Scripture. Jesus said, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel." And so Jim felt that that was what he called the categorical imperative, unless you could prove otherwise. So he was a spiritual leader, a campus clown. He was also an athlete. They called him the India Rubber Man. He was a wrestler and could be tied into unbelievable knots by his opponents, but never once in his career was he pinned. And he won the championship of 4 states in his weight class. In addition to all of those things, he graduated with highest honor in classical Greek. I don't think it was because he was a genius. I think it was because he applied himself and he eliminated what he called the non-essentials. And another thing that he eliminated from his schedule was an hour of precious sleep before breakfast in the morning. He got up early enough to spend an hour in prayer and Bible reading before breakfast. I didn't know any other college students that did that, and I was impressed. The only reason I found out about that was because my brother happened to live in the same house with Jim and reported that to me. But when our yearbooks came out, I was a senior, Jim was a junior. And during my senior year, I had become more and more interested in watching this man, but I had no reason to think that he had ever looked twice at me. But when our yearbooks came out, we used to try to get everybody's autographs, and it was with a good deal of trepidation that I approached Jim for an autograph, hoping that he would write something besides just his name, perhaps some little cryptic message that might give me some reason to hope that he had thought about me, but I didn't think I had a chance in the world. But he did write his name with a flowing, sweeping hand, and then very quickly something underneath, shut the book, handed it back to me. I quickly found the page and saw that he'd written a scripture reference. Now, you know how long it took me to get back to the dormitory, to grab my Bible and find out what and to my utter amazement, these were the words that I found. A soldier on active service will not become entangled in civilian affairs. He must be wholly at his commanding officer's disposal. 2 Timothy 2:4. I like that too. And I saw that here was a man who had made a final and irrevocable choice. And as I talk to college students today, I find that there are precious few of them who have made any final, let alone irrevocable, choices. They know what they want on their Big Mac, and that's about it. They're not really sure about much of anything else. Whether they like this college, or this major, or this professor, or this roommate, or this idea of a career, or this girlfriend, they're just not really sure. And what I liked about Jim Elliot was that here was a man who had set his face like a flint, and he went down that path like a thunderbolt. And he had decided that he had a commanding officer, and he was wholly at his disposal. Now I will skip over the next 7 years. If you want to hear the story of how I became Jim Elliot's wife, then you have to read either his biography, Shadow of the Almighty, or this book, Passion and Purity, which I mentioned. But after we were married, we were working together with a tribe of Indians called the Quichuas. When the pilot flew in one day, the pilot that served our station, with the tremendously exciting news that he had located the savage tribe called Aucas, located from the air. And it was then that what was called Operation Auca began. Jim and Nate, the pilot, Ed McCulley, another young man whom I had known in college, Pete Fleming, a man from Seattle, Washington, and Roger Udarian, a cowboy from Montana who had been a paratrooper in World War II, banded together to pray and plan for an entrance into the Auca tribe to take the gospel. In January 1956, they believed that God's time had come, and they went to that territory. They set up a camp in the edge of Auca territory. They had what appeared to be a very friendly contact with 3 Auca Indians a few days later. They took movies of that contact, movies which are still available in the form of a documentary film, and 2 days later, they were speared to death, all 5 of them. Now I said that my purpose in life is to know God, to love Him. My method is trust and obedience. Jim was a tremendous example to me, as were all 5 of us men, of trust and obedience, because we knew very well the reputation of these Indians. Nobody had ever gone into their territory and come out alive. Quite a few people had gone in there, but nobody had ever been heard from again. So it wasn't lightly that any of us participated in Operation Auca. It was with the full recognition of the risks. But obedience to God always requires a certain element of risk, doesn't it? Because obedience is our job. The results are His. And so, as we planned and prayed, these men had already long since made up their minds that they were expendable for God. Not that any of them was looking for death, not that any of them really thought it would happen to him. You know, there's always that human idea that we have that, well, it might happen, but it can't really happen to us. And they sang on the eve of their departure for that enterprise a hymn, "We rest on Thee, our shield and our defender. We go not forth alone against the foe." And you can be sure that when we got the word by shortwave radio that these men were dead, I thought a lot about that hymn. A hymn that we had sung in family prayers at home too. "We rest on Thee, our shield and our defender." And that God who teaches us to trust Him, who had called these 5 men from possibly very lucrative careers if they had stayed in this country, made them obedient, given them a concern for these people who had never heard the name of Christ, led them step by step through the months of Operation Auca, answered hundreds of prayers, that God would in fact allow them to be speared to death. My question to you tonight is, what kind of a God do you trust? And what might your obedience cost? I trust a God who's got the whole world where? In His hands. He's got you and me, brother, in His hands. And there is nothing from here to eternity, life or death, things present or things to come, that can ever touch me or anybody I love without the permission of that God who loves me. And that God who demonstrated forever, for all time, his love on this cross. He loved me and gave himself for me. I have two choices in life. Either I believe that he is God and he's got the whole world in his hands and he does know what he's doing and he still loves me. Or he's not God. He hasn't got the whole world in his hands. I'm at the mercy of chance. And what happened on that cross didn't mean a thing. As I see it, there is no middle ground. It doesn't make any difference what happens. He's still there. Christ has died. Christ is risen. Christ will come again. Trust and obedience is what he asks. And so when it seemed to be God's will that I was to go and try to make contact with these same people, I thought, this is preposterous. God would never ask a widow with a baby, she was 10 months old when he was killed, to do anything about the Alkas. But I said to the Lord a prayer that I thought I was very safe in praying. I'm available, Lord. And I guess that there's hardly anybody in this room who at some time or other hasn't said, thy will be done. And when God starts doing it, we get very surprised. And he says, but isn't it what you asked? It's either thy will be done, which is the rule of heaven, or it's my will be done, which is the rule of you know where. There isn't any other choice. And so I had said, Lord, I'm available, and in a very amazing and roundabout way, what seemed to be roundabout, God got me there. And I haven't got time to tell you that story tonight. It's in a book called Savage, My Kinsman. The purpose is to love God, to know him, to make him loved and known. The method, trust, and obedience. The cost, what did Jesus say? If you lose your life for my sake, you'll find it. The man who wants to save his life will lose it. And the world is constantly coming at us with all kinds of suggestions about how to save ourselves. And Jesus cuts right through that nonsense and says, if you want to be my disciple, you must give up your right to yourself and take up your cross and follow me. The man who would lose his life will find his true self. And Jim Elliot had written in his diary when he was only 22 these amazing words. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. And of course, the whole world heard about this massacre in Ecuador. The news went around the world, and people came and began to ask us widows, why did they do it? And they were called all kinds of terrible names. And there was a lot of very glib editorializing in the Christian magazines and newspapers that I found more upsetting than some of the criticisms that came from the world, which incidentally were relatively few. Life magazine gave us very fair and respectful treatment. When people honestly wanted to know, why did they go in there? Did they know what they were getting into? And of course we said yes. I thought of the verse in 1 John 2:17. The world and all its passionate desires will one day disappear. But the man who is following the will of God is part of a permanent and cannot die. Now those men gave witness to their trust in a faithful God through their death, far more powerfully than they could have ever imagined doing if they had lived. And of course we are left to ask all the painful questions, why. And many of the older missionaries in Ecuador said, we've never had 5 such promising young men. They were the cream of the cream. Why didn't God take me? And of course, God is not under any obligation to explain himself to you and me. We're infants. We have no idea what our Father is up to. He's engineering a universe. He's got a whole lot more things to choreograph and orchestrate than you and I can even begin to imagine. Another thing Jim wrote in his diary was, God is peopling eternity, and I must not limit him to old men and women. In another page he said, I ask not for a long life, but for a full one like yours, Lord Jesus. Have my blood, Lord, he prayed. Have it all. Let it be poured out for the life of the world. In 2 Corinthians 5 it says, Christ died that men should cease to live for themselves. That brings us to the cost. Discipleship, obedience to Jesus Christ, demands everything. Nothing short of everything. You must present your body a living sacrifice. And if God chooses to make that quite literal and physical, after all, you've turned over the rights, haven't you? And there was no question in my mind that Jim had turned over the rights, all the rights, many years before this incident. And that if God had given him a choice of how he wanted to die, I have no doubt that Jim would have chosen exactly the way God permitted him to die in that effort to take the gospel to those people. Well, some of you may be sitting there thinking, oh, that's an amazing story, that's a wonderful story, but that's happened a million years ago and a million miles away. It's got nothing to do with me and where I live here in Ohio or Pennsylvania with my job and my responsibilities and my children and my family or whatever. Hasn't it? Hasn't it got anything to do with you? Isn't the Lord calling you to do exactly the same thing to which he called those 5 men? To make the truth visible in the way you live and in the way you die. Whose are you? Are you wholly at his disposal? A soldier on active service does not become entangled in civilian affairs. He must be wholly at his commanding officer's disposal. We are people whose lives are shaped by what we love. Do you love God? Do you want to make him known? If we are Christians, does the gospel that we offer the world promise exemption from suffering? Can we say, if you'll become a Christian, God will sort out all your marital problems, pay all your debts, give you a Volkswagen, give you a Cadillac instead of a Volkswagen, and solve all your problems before supper tonight? Is that the gospel that we preach? The gospel is Christ crucified. The Son of Man, the Son of God, was put into the hands of evil men. For me, for you. And so if we're going to follow him, it entails suffering. Because one who is crucified is going to lead us to a cross. And that's our message. That cross does not exempt us, but it transforms our sufferings. I love what George MacDonald wrote in the 19th century. He suffered not that we might not suffer, but that our sufferings might be like his. And I can speak from the experience of losing 2 husbands, as well as other kinds of losses and sorrows, and say with all my heart, God is faithful. He does give the oil of joy for mourning, the garment of praise for the spirit of heaviness. and beauty for ashes. The message of the cross is not a message of exemption, but a message of transformation. And I'm always wanting to ask people who call themselves Christians, what kind of a difference does it make in your life? Do you never get sick? Does nothing bad ever happen to you? Does God sort out all your problems? And usually the answer is, of course, no. In fact, I've had more trouble since I became a Christian than I ever had before. Does that sound familiar to some of you? Think of those disciples. What simple, peaceful lives they lived as fishermen. And think of Peter being crucified upside down, we're told. Because he followed Christ. Not always faithfully, but he was a follower. So what kind of a difference does it make? Well, I just told you a tiny bit of the difference that it made in my life. When I stood beside my radio and learned that my husband was missing, the words that God brought to my mind then were, "When thou passest through the waters, I will be with thee. And through the rivers, they shall not overflow thee." He doesn't tell us that we will not have to walk through the valley of the shadow of death. But he does promise us that we will never have to walk through it alone. I will fear no evil, not because there isn't any, but because thou art with me. Evangelism. Witnessing means making the truth visible. My purpose is to know and love him, and to make him known and loved. The method is trust and obedience, and that means every hour of every day, of every week, of every month, of every year, until I reach the celestial city. And the cost is everything. But now think about this. What, pray tell, do I have to offer that isn't going to be repaid so many thousands of times over that it would be like giving 1 cent or, can I say, $1 billion? Does that even begin? To give a glimpse of the hundredfold that Christ promises. That transformation. I bring him my sins, and he gives me his righteousness. I bring him my sorrows, he gives me his joy. I bring him my losses, he gives me his gain. I bring him my sufferings, he gives me his glory. If you suffer with me, he says, you will also reign. The sufferings of this present time, the Apostle Paul said, are not worthy to be compared with the weight of glory which is to be revealed. That makes a difference. That makes the difference between night and day for the life of a Christian. He is the God whom we serve. And every day, I pray that God will make my life a witness in the sense of making that truth visible. I'd like to close with a poem written by a great missionary to India named Carmichael. A poem that Jim Elliot used to quote very often when he would go out on gospel teams from college to try to stir up other college students to be interested in foreign missionary service. This is the poem. Hast thou no scar, no hidden scar on side or foot or hand? I hear thee sung as mighty in the land. Hast thou no scar? Hast thou no wound? Yet I was wounded by the archers, spent, leaned me against a tree to die, and rent by ravening beasts that compassed me. I swooned. Hast thou no wound? No wound, no scar, yet as the master must the servant be, and pierced are the feet that follow me. But thine are whole. Can he have followed far? who has no wound or scar. God bless you.